Good morning, aloha, welcome to Friday. My name is Brian Whedon. I'm the technical advisor at Secure World Foundation, and I'm happy to be the moderator of this morning's Policy Forum session. First up this morning, I'd like to introduce our keynote speaker for today, Dr. George C. Neild. Dr. Neild serves as the Associate Administrator for Commercial Space Transportation at the FAA. He has over 30 years of aerospace experience with the Air Force, at NASA, and in private industry. Dr. Neild came to the FAA from the Orbital Sciences Corporation, where he served as Senior Scientist for the Advanced Programs Group. His previous assignments include working as an astronautical engineer at the Space and Missile Systems Organization, a flight test engineer at the Air Force Flight Test Center, and as Assistant Professor and Research Director at the U.S. Air Force Academy. He was manager of the Flight Integration Office for the Space Shuttle program at the NASA Johnson Space Center, and later worked on both the Shuttle Mir program and the International Space Station program. He was recently appointed by the NASA Administrator to serve on the Aerospace Safety Advisory Panel. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Neild.
Thank you, Brian, and good morning, everyone. Ever since the Soviet Union launched Yuri Gagarin into space, making him the first person to leave the planet, almost all of our significant accomplishments in space have been done by the government. Whether you're talking about the record-setting flights of the X-15, Project Mercury, Gemini, the Apollo moon landings, 30 years of flying the space shuttle, or building and working on board the International Space Station, it's been the government that has planned, directed, and carried out our space programs. Well, going forward, that is not necessarily always going to be the case. Private industry is going to be playing a key role in our space programs, and that's especially true if we're talking about low Earth orbit and the suborbital space arena. So this morning I'd like to talk a little bit about why I think that's the case, what's going on in the commercial space world, what are we going to be seeing in the next few years, and some of the challenges and opportunities that will provide to us, especially when it comes to space situational awareness. Let me start by answering a question that you may be asking yourselves right now, and that is, why is the FAA involved in this at all? And the answer is that based on the Commercial Space Launch Act of 1984, any U.S. citizen that wants to conduct the launch of a launch vehicle anywhere in the world needs to come to our office and get a license. And the only exceptions to that are for missions that are conducted by and for the government. So NASA did not need a license to fly the space shuttle. The Air Force does not need a license from the FAA if they're carrying out the launch of their national security missions. But anyone else, big or small, old or new, needs to work with us. Now, altogether, there have been 238 FAA licensed launches over the years, and all of those have been conducted without any fatalities, serious injuries, or property damage to the uninvolved public, which is the responsibility that we have. We have a twofold statutory mission. First of all, to ensure public safety during commercial launch and reentry activities. And then secondly, to encourage, facilitate, and promote commercial space transportation. Now, this mission lines up very nicely with our national space policy, which was put out in June of 2010, in which it committed the United States to encouraging and facilitating the growth of the commercial space sector that supports U.S. needs, is globally competitive, and advances U.S. leadership in the generation of new markets and innovation-driven entrepreneurship. But actually, having private sector play a role is not a new idea. In fact, there have actually been 3 presidential commissions on space so far this century. the Walker Commission back in 2002, the Aldrich Commission in 2004, and the Augustine Committee in 2009, and all of those have called for increased reliance on private industry. So let's talk for a minute about why we have a space program in the first place. If you're a government, there may be a number of different reasons for operating in space, relating to things like national security, technological leadership, international competitiveness, scientific curiosity, or inspiration for students. But how about if you're a company or a private individual and you want to have a space program? Well, you might have some of the same rationale as the government has, or there might be some other factors at play. You could just be really passionate about space and want to make a difference. Or you could see an opportunity to make money. Now, there's an old saying that the best way to make a small fortune in space is to start with a large fortune. But there are some people who seem to think that there's that pot of gold at the end of the rainbow, right? One of those is Neil deGrasse Tyson. And he's on the record as saying that the first trillionaire there will ever be is the person who figures out how to exploit the natural resources on asteroids. Of course, sometimes it takes money to make money, but interestingly enough, there are a number of people who are putting their money where their mouth is. And if you look at the Forbes 2015 billionaires list, there's currently 1,826 billionaires around the world. About a third of those live in the US. But if you look at the whole list, there are a number of names that will be familiar to those of us who work in the aerospace industry. Paul Allen, said to be worth about $17.5 billion, who provided funding for Scaled Composites and winning the Ansari X Prize, and who's now set up a new company, Stratolaunch, which plans to build the world's largest aircraft as a carrier aircraft for accessing space. Jeff Bezos, who's formed his own space company, Blue Origin. Richard Branson, who with Virgin Galactic is trying to bring suborbital space tourism to the market. And Elon Musk, who's done a lot of different things, but one of which is to establish SpaceX, which is having a very disruptive and innovative impact on aerospace. There's a number of others who aren't on the billionaires list, but they've also put a considerable amount of their own fortune on the line, and they include people like Robert Bigelow, who made his money in the hotel business and who now has formed Bigelow Aerospace to build habitats in space. Dennis Tito, the first person to pay his own way to orbit, and who gained some of his capabilities through the financial sector. And John Carmack, who made his money in the software and video game industry and who formed Armadillo Aerospace that did some amazing things at the Lunar Lander Challenge competition. I think it's important to recognize, though, that if we're talking about doing things in space, it's not necessarily an either-or situation. It's not necessarily just government or just private industry. There's a lot of opportunities for working together, for partnership, public-private cooperation, such that government needs can be met by industry capabilities. Government has a lot of smart people. They have some great expertise when it comes to space. They have more than 50 years of experience doing things in space, and they have a continuing need for space products and services. On the industry side, there's at least the potential for a lot of things that would be good. Lower cost, increased innovation, greater risk tolerance, possibly new customers and new markets, or even new sources of funding. Well, if there's all those good things, how come we don't rely on industry all the time? And the answer is there's a catch. And that is, to achieve those benefits from industry, the government may need to change its historical practices and even its culture. You see, loss of control by the government can be extremely difficult sometimes, as I'm sure you all know. But being flexible on program requirements and how they can be satisfied can often result in a lot of advantages. So given that that's the environment in which we find ourselves now, let's talk a little bit about some markets. I think everybody is aware that you can make money now if you have a big communication satellite. That's been established and proven, and it's going to continue. But I'd like to talk about 13 other current or potential markets for commercial space. First of all, launching satellites. There's a lot of companies right now that are building rockets, and they range from the established large aerospace firms to the smaller entrepreneurial types. And they're coming up with a lot of great ideas to do that safely, reliably, and cost-effectively. There are a number of teams that are announcing plans to launch hundreds or even thousands of small satellites for a variety of purposes: telecommunications, Earth observations, weather data, broadband internet service. That's really a new paradigm, and it's going to cause some interesting benefits as well as some interesting challenges for us. Commercial cargo. Right now, NASA has contracts with two companies, SpaceX and Orbital ATK, to take food, clothes, supplies, and scientific equipment up to our astronauts on board the International Space Station. And NASA also has contracts with two companies, SpaceX and Boeing, to develop the capability to take people to and from the International Space Station. Now, Sierra Nevada Corporation was not selected in that first round of competition, but they are strongly behind their mini shuttle concept called the Dream Chaser, and they plan to look for other sources of funding and other customers so that they can continue to develop this commercial crew capability. Bigelow Aerospace plans to operate commercial space stations, and whether they are connected to the ISS or standalone habitats, they're basically just waiting for the transportation capability to be brought to market and proven, and then they're ready to go to the market with their products and services. Companies like Vivisat is talking about offering the capability to do satellite servicing, where you can refuel or reposition existing satellites on orbit. There's now 10 FAA licensed spaceports around the country, and they range from Spaceport America in New Mexico that plans to host suborbital space tourism operations to Houston Spaceport, our most recent licensee, who envisions a future in which they can be an intermodal transportation hub for long-distance, high-speed transportation through space. There's a half a dozen companies that are talking to us right now about how to develop, build, and test vehicles that are capable of taking people up to the edge of space, where you're going to be able to look out the window and see black sky and the curvature of the Earth and experience the magic of weightlessness. Suborbital space tourism. You don't have to be a NASA astronaut anymore to get spaceflight training. Companies like NASTAR outside Philadelphia have a centrifuge in which you can experience the acceleration that you would encounter during a suborbital spaceflight. They can put you in an altitude chamber with a helmet and mask such that you can experience what it's really like to undergo that sudden change in cabin pressure that we hear about all the time in our airline safety briefings. Zero Gravity Corporation has an aircraft that can perform parabolic aircraft trajectories such that you can experience weightlessness at 30 seconds a pop. And Waypoint to Space will allow you to try on a spacesuit and see what doing a spacewalk is all about. Companies like Maston and Up Aerospace have basically come up with what is a reusable sounding rocket, such that you can test out and demonstrate hardware or software related to space. And companies like Virgin Galactic, Swiss Space Systems, and the German space agency DLR are spending a lot of time and effort looking at point-to-point transportation through space, such that you would be able to take off from the US and within a couple hours be on the other side of the world. Bigelow has noticed that because of the reduced gravity on the moon, it may be possible to assemble some of their space station modules in space and then basically soft land the whole complex on the lunar surface. So that sort of jump starts the idea of having a lunar base without thinking about building it brick by brick. And companies like Shackleton Energy, Deep Space Industries, and Planetary Resources are looking at things like asteroid mining, or seeing if you can extract ice and hence water from the lunar regolith. Once you have water, you can break that into oxygen and hydrogen. Voila, rocket propellant. So those are some of the markets that I see out there. But taken together, they're presenting some interesting challenges and opportunities, and I'd like to highlight 3 of those here this morning. How can we encourage and support new, non-traditional commercial operations in space? What should we do, if anything, in response to the proliferation of CubeSats and the increase in orbital debris? And finally, what's the best way to provide space traffic management services? I talked about some of the new markets that are out there, including satellite servicing and lunar bases, commercial space stations, and extracting resources in space. And interestingly, even though a lot of work is being done and people are out there trying to raise money to perform those, in general, not as government programs, but as private industry activities, when they go door to door in Washington and ask, so who do we go to get permission to do this? The answer is, who knows? We've never done one of those before. And in fact, what we're hearing from the State Department is there may be some issues with treaties, specifically the Outer Space Treaty, in which Article 6 says that the activities of non-governmental entities in outer space shall require authorization and continuing supervision by the appropriate state party to the treaty. So we're comfortable with ComSats and Earth remote sensing and so forth, but some of these other things, they don't fit nice and neatly into our existing regulatory framework. Right now, today, the FAA is responsible for licensing commercial launches and reentries, but not what happens in between. The FCC has responsibility for licensing radio broadcasts from space. NOAA is in charge of remote sensing operations, like taking pictures of the Earth. Now, obviously, DoD and NASA are key players in space, but they're not regulatory agencies. So we've got an issue there. One idea that industry has put forward through ComStack, our Commercial Space Transportation Advisory Committee, would be if Congress were to authorize the FAA to issue something called a mission license, then we would have the ability to enable, to approve, to authorize some of these non-traditional activities so that we could reduce the regulatory uncertainty that they're currently facing and proceed with their planning. And that would take care of our treaty obligations. A second issue that I'd like to talk to is the proliferation of CubeSats. Now, this data goes through the first half of last year, but there's no signs that it is abating. There's a lot of stuff up there now, and it's just going to continue to get worse. The problem is more and more of these are being launched every year, and as spacecraft get smaller, of course, they're becoming more difficult to track. And currently, there's no limits on altitude or inclination, so I think it's conceivable that some of the popular orbits are going to become even more congested in the future. Now, today, NASA and the military are doing a pretty good job of following the international guidelines, but there is no requirement for commercial operators to follow those guidelines today. And because they typically have short operational lifetimes and or limited reliability, many CubeSats end up quickly turning into orbital debris. It's getting crowded out there. I don't know how many of you saw the movie Gravity. There's many technical flaws with some of the things that they talked about, but when it comes to depicting what a bad day in space would look like, I think it was pretty realistic, and that really got a lot of people's attention. And so today, with that as one example, and with some specific real-world examples, some intentional and some not intentional, of collisions in space, we're hearing more talk about space traffic management. Now, what is that? Well, I don't think there is any universally accepted definition, but when I talk about that phrase, I'm talking basically about an umbrella, a category, something that is general, and it encompasses things like the technical and regulatory provisions and processes that are used to oversee, coordinate, regulate, and promote safe and responsible space activities, including access to space, operations in space, and return from space, to avoid both physical and electromagnetic interference. There's a lot of different stakeholders, a lot of different government agencies. Each have a piece of that STM products and services menu today. The problem is that in the United States, we don't have a system that integrates the entire menu, that in combination can promote safe and responsible operations. We don't have a structure that efficiently combines those responsibilities. At the same time, we have an obligation to carry out our treaty responsibilities, including the supervision of non-government activities. We're internationally liable for actions by U.S. citizens. And no one, even the Air Force, has complete knowledge of where everything is and what they're planning to do in the future. And I think there's general consensus that there's also a need to improve our debris mitigation procedures. So given that there's a number of different sources of information today related to space traffic, what are we seeing? Well, not surprisingly, we're seeing commercial entities that are beginning to step forward and fill the void. We're seeing other nations and international organizations that are at least starting to talk, if not act, about creating international oversight structures. So what if the U.S. decided that it wanted to take a leadership role? What could we do? What would a successful outcome look like? Well, I think we need to be practical. We need to recognize that it's pretty hard to talk about starting with a clean sheet and having a Department of Space or something like that, such that everything is perfectly well organized. So if there's a way to do this without totally upsetting the apple cart, without taking budgets and moving around and people and organizational structures and so forth, then that would be helpful. But at the same time, we would like to see if there's a way to fuse and to integrate existing capabilities. We'd like to have an end state in which you had high-fidelity space situational awareness, in which we could prevent collisions and radio frequency interference, in which we could mitigate orbital debris risks, in which we had increased safety and mission assurance, and in which we could continue our U.S. leadership in space and in space situational awareness, at the same time offer an opportunity for greater international cooperation, transparency, and collaboration. So is there a way to do that? I think there is. I think there is. And I would like to offer 3 actions that I think would take us a long way towards having the kind of outcome that we'd all like to see. First of all, it would involve designating the Department of Transportation, and then by delegation the FAA, as the lead federal agency for coordinating the oversight of new, non-traditional in-space operations by the private sector. Because again, today, there is no one in charge of what's happening in space, especially from the safety perspective. Secondly, if there was a way to expand the FAA authority to close that regulatory gap for in-space operations. Right now we've got launch and reentry, but nothing in between. And then finally, if we can work with DoD to talk about transitioning at least the commercial collision avoidance assessments that the Air Force has currently provided. I may think, well, isn't DoD pushing back on that? Sounds like you're trying to take their responsibilities. And if you talk to senior leadership, that's really not the case. If you talk to folks like the General Kowalski, the Deputy Commander of STRATCOM, he'll say things like, hey, STRATCOM needs to be warfighters, not FAA in space. And even more specifically, Doug Lavero, the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Space Policy, has said the FAA really should be in charge of managing what's going on in space. Now, he didn't mean that the FAA should be directing DoD and where they maneuver their satellites. No. What he's talking about is that issuing collision avoidance warnings to private companies and to other countries really isn't a core military mission. And they have enough on their plate right now worrying about national security things in space. So we need some congressional action. What's going on there? Well, there's two bills that have been passed by Congress so far, one by the House and one by the Senate, and they're different. H.R. 2262, the Space Act of 2015, calls for NASA to contract out a report on space traffic management and orbital debris, and it would include things like an assessment of current regulations, best practices, industry standards, the current authorities that the regulators have, FCC, FAA, NOAA, current treaty requirements, existing assets for space traffic management and SSA, looking at the risk associated with small sats, and then making some recommendations for the proper frameworks to protect public safety and economic vitality of our industry. The Senate's got S 1297, U.S. Commercial Space Launch Competitiveness Act, and in that bill, OSTP is told to prepare a report on Space Authority that would assess current and proposed commercial space activities, identify appropriate oversight authorities, and recommend an oversighted approach. At the same time, in our chain of command, the Secretary of Transportation is told to prepare a report on SSA that would look at processing and releasing safety-related SSA data to any entity consistent with national security interests and public safety obligations. So, just some closing thoughts. I think that commercial space companies increasingly have the potential to carry out activities that used to be only in the government's purview, and in some cases to do that even without government funding. But there are a number of things that the government can and should do in the near term to decrease barriers, streamline policies, eliminate regulatory uncertainty, and increase on-orbit safety. So, speaking for the FAA's Office of Commercial Space Transportation, we're willing to step forward and to take on additional responsibility in this area. We're committed to working with Congress and with industry to enable industry's success and ensure continued U.S. leadership in space. Thank you very much.
We do have time for one or two questions. If you'd like to text them to the same number that was used yesterday. So, Dr. Neal, a question to get started. You talked quite a bit about the U.S. government's approach and the U.S. working through the executive branch, interagency, and Congress. What about the international community? I mean, this is not just a U.S. kind of a problem. Do you see this as something where the U.S. is going to take the lead and hopefully set the example, or how do you see that interaction?
So that's a great question. We need to be talking about that throughout the world right now. But given how difficult it is to end up with international agreements and treaties and so forth, even though it could be done top down or bottoms up. I think the best approach right now is to crawl, walk, run. Let's have the U.S. get its act together first, demonstrate some leadership, be a role model, and then other countries can decide, would they like to come together and get in line with that and be consistent with that in the same way that we've done for aviation.
So you listed your major recommendations for how you think the U.S. can go forward. What do you see as the biggest challenges to actually making those 3 recommendations happen?
We've been talking about this for several years. The challenge, apparently, is deciding to actually do something about it. And it's real easy to say, well, it's so complicated. We better study this for a while. But this is getting more difficult by the day. The longer we put this off, the harder it's going to be to fix.
So getting over that initial inertia and actually... Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. So one final question here. In your mind, what do you think the U.S. government can do to improve innovation and kind of foster what's already going on, but make sure it happens, even better? So
speaking as a regulator, I think too often government agencies tend to just have their heads down and say, here's my mission, here's what I'm trying to do, and you end up saying no a lot. Fortunately, we have that statutory mission that not only asks us to ensure public safety, but directs us to encourage, facilitate, and promote the industry. So we take that part of our mission very seriously, and we think about that in the work that we do every day.
Great.
All right, thanks, Brian.
Thank you very much. All right, for part 2 of our discussion this morning, we've put together what hopefully will be an interesting panelist of people to take on some of the issues that Dr. Neal raised and hopefully provide a little bit better perspective. As alluded to by Dr. Neal, the theme for today's panel discussion is how all of this activity in the commercial sector is creating both challenges and opportunities. As Dr. Neal highlighted, and I think as many of us have seen, over the last few years, we have seen a significant increase in private sector activity in space. Some of that is actually coming to fruition. Quite a bit of that is planned coming down the road in the near future. What that's driving that is this, further commoditization of technology, a huge increase in capital, and I think a growing awareness of what kind of benefits can be derived from using space. Related to the topic of AMOS, all of this change and increased activity and commercial activity in space is going to create a number of challenges for space situation awareness, tracking with space debris, even space traffic managers Dr. Neal alluded to. But also I think at the same time it's going to create some opportunities. I think that there are going to be some areas where this commercial innovation is going to help this community address and solve some of the challenges that we're still grappling with. So that's sort of the topic that we wanted to talk about this morning in our discussion. The first speaker this morning on the panel is Mike Lindsay. He's the systems engineering lead for OneWeb. Mike leads the space mission design, orbit analysis, and fleet operations simulation development team for OneWeb. He's responsible for the safe, sustainable design of the constellation, striving to minimize RF interference and keep low Earth orbit clean. Prior to joining OneWeb, Mike worked with NASA Ames Research Center on design and analysis of advanced space mission concepts. Mike?
Thank you, Brian. And I want to thank AMOS and MEDB. This is my first time at this conference, and it's been really great. I really love the discussions and the community here. I've been learning a lot, especially as a first-timer here. I think many of you are probably familiar with OneWeb. Probably made quite a splash in the SSA community when we announced we're launching hundreds and hundreds of satellites into low Earth orbit. But I want to take a couple minutes to talk about our mission. So OneWeb is all about the access to information. We think about our modern lives and how dependent we are on connectivity in this instant information. That becomes apparent when the internet goes out at work or you forget your phone at home. Until those things happen, I think many of us almost take this for granted. Yet billions of people in this world are unconnected and don't have access to this information. And you can imagine how much of a disadvantage that is economically for agriculture, commerce, medical science, especially in times of epidemic. There's also emergency response for earthquakes, tsunamis, just the coordination, and it's all dependent on communication and the exchange of information. So it's apparent just how critical this is for growth and development, and it really should be a fundamental right. Though achieving this connectivity via a fiber would be financially impossible, and that's why space is the right platform for this. And if we want an experience that's similar to what we get when we log on to computers, we need low latency. And so global coverage plus low latency, that's how you get to a constellation of 648 satellites in low Earth orbit. And this is an ambitious endeavor, and it would not be possible without the advancements we made and the advancements that you've all made in SSA. And I think that's worth mentioning, just how enabling that is for this mission. But there's still significant challenges in the operation and design of this constellation. It does present some more risks. But it's going to be possible with the data sharing and the advanced analyses and responsible operation. Just some of the examples of what we're doing. We've been closely coordinating with JSPOC to develop a ConOps that is efficient for both of us and reduces risk on both sides. AGI has been sharing some risk analyses with us. We've also been working with SpaceNav to look at very specific scenarios to understand the risks inherent in our design and how we can be responsible operators. It's really important to us to understand the potential impacts and how we can best design this mission. I'd like to say we don't want to just be compliant and just kind of check the box and say that, we followed the rules. In some ways we want to sort of lead by example. These large constellations, it's a bit of a new animal, and we're not the only ones being proposed here. And we acknowledge that some of the policies are either insufficient or simply don't exist. And I think it's apparent in these discussions that policy may be lagging behind the advancements that we're making. So we need to set the precedent for some of the practices that may be involved with these large constellations. But we don't pretend to understand everything and say that, what we're doing is best. And that's part of the reason why we're here, to engage with the community and see what others think. So I just want to welcome questions and concerns and perhaps recommendations for maybe what we should be looking into. So thank you very much.
So our second panelist this morning is Stuart Bain. Stuart is president and CEO of Northstar Data Incorporated. He's got 28 years of experience designing, developing aerospace systems. He's been in the business of commercializing disruptive technologies globally since 1996. He's a member of the board of directors of the AIAC and has previously served as the president of the board advisory committee of the Quebec Aerospace Association. He's founder of Bain Consulting International and has worked in the aerospace market across the world. Stuart?
Thank you, Brian, and thank you for the invitation to be here. It's an honor to be amongst all of these brilliant people on the subject of that we're discussing, which is space. Thank you for putting me second, because clearly while I was watching Curling with the Stars, I did not prepare anything for what I was supposed to say this morning. So having listened to my colleague to my right, I realized I better put something together while he's talking. Let's start with giving credit where credit is due. We stand on the shoulders of giants. And oftentimes in Canada, where we spend most of our time playing hockey and curling, we do give the Canadian Space Agency a hard time for saying, what's your role in space and why is government so involved in space? And It's like asking a civil engineer, for the last 100 years, your only client for bridges seems to be the government. I mean, what's wrong with your business model? It's a kind of a ridiculous question, because we stand on the shoulders of people who went before us to just create the opportunity for us to be here. And I guess one of the giants that we stand on, believe it or not, or like it or not, is the JSPOC in terms of what we're going to be proposing to do. People develop an infrastructure that was intended for an initial purpose, and then in comes a whole onslaught of other ideas and opportunities that strain the system and say, wow, we really need to go to a next step. So that prompts potentially government or industry to step in and find a solution. To describe a little bit about what we do at North Star, we're born in Tempe, Arizona, with an organization named Kinetics, which has world-class capabilities in satellite navigation and flight dynamics. And they came up with a concept for this mission, working with our partners, North Star Satellite Systems, Inc., also based in Tempe, as to how we could fill in the white spaces. Where are the white spaces in the industry and in the market and in the demands, as the chart showed that Dr. Neil put up, government overlapping industry capabilities? Well, we're proposing a constellation of 40 satellites in low Earth orbit that will provide Earth observation products to multiple markets. Our slogan is changing the way we see the world. And changing the way we see the world is more philosophical than directive in terms of saying we're going to change the way you see the world. The way we see the world in terms of what we can do to improve the challenges or address the challenges that we're facing. Between now and 2050, the world's population will grow to 9 billion people. That will strain our natural resources. That will strain our very capabilities to the limit of what we are going to do to manage this onslaught of demand for energy, for forestry products, for mining, for water, for infrastructure, for urban planning. And so we propose to fill in the white spaces because in the context of the instruments that we select, we will monitor the Earth using hyperspectral imagery, which is, for those of you who don't know, 256 bands of frequency to look at the Earth, and then use that cube, that data cube per pixel to look at specific features, what's happening specifically in crops and predicting their changes in the future, et cetera. We'll also use infrared imagers. So having come up with a fantastic plan for Earth observation, like everyone else, we looked at the back end of the zenith pointing end of the spacecraft and said, well, what will we do with that? Well, we could go into the business of renting out secondary payloads, but that seems to be a crowded market. And so we decided maybe we should come up with our own. And that's, I think, why I'm here, because we came up with the idea that we will put on cameras into space situational awareness. And it also seemed like a good idea because, back to our founding corporation in Tempe, Arizona, they do satellite navigation and flight dynamics. And they did New Horizon going to Pluto, they did Messenger going to Mercury, and they did OSIRIS-REx. So to use a US analogy, when you look at space with 40 instruments from LEO, it's a space-based space situational awareness option. You have 40 instruments that could provide stereo, resilient coverage of all of the objects in LEO down to 10 centimeters, which is potentially hundreds of thousands of objects. It's a lot of data to process. It's a lot of mathematics. But what we're all about is when you look at the position of any object in space, whether it's a satellite or a piece of debris, there's an error ellipsoid associated with that object. And that usually takes the shape of a football, which is an American analogy because we play football in Canada, but it's usually only the folks that couldn't make it into the NFL. So it's a story of our existence. And I think the thing that scared John Hill the most was that we all live within 90 miles of your border, and we're all ready to just rush in and, you'll have to protect yourselves against this. It's another space situational awareness problem.
Building a wall.
Build a wall. We'll probably pay for it willingly because that's the kind of thing we do. We just say we're sorry and back off. But, sorry. How about a donut from Tim Hortons? Anyway, so back to the football analogy. I say, it's about reducing the size of that football. And I say, damn it, if Tom Brady can reduce the size of his balls, we can reduce the size of them too. I don't even know what that means, because when I saw the headline, Tom Brady deflates his balls, I said, wow. Who is he anyway? It seems to be important to Americans, though. So the error ellipsoid is in the shape of a football, and the more data you have looking at it and the more instruments you have looking at it, the less that football gets in shape and smaller and smaller. So you can actually provide quality data and resilient data to folks on a commercial level or on a government level as to what you're doing. And as I say, we're standing on the shoulders of giants. I was both impressed and moved by Scott Putnam's comments yesterday in the working group about, what keeps him awake at night, and the comments that he has about managing the JSPOC. I would not like to have his job, and God bless him for doing what he does for as long as they've been doing it, because it's a serious challenge that has grown and will continue to grow. So I guess what we're saying is, in the changing the way we see the world, we'll offer instruments to do that, but we'll offer opportunities for others to use our data and to cooperate with others. It's a big market. It's a cooperative market. We don't see anybody as a competitor. We think this is a collaborative way to continue. And we hope that we can contribute something from an industrial perspective and cooperate with the FAA, with Doug Lavero and his team at Space Policy to figure out how we can provide this service. We're not talking about just dumping the data out to the general public. We're talking about providing conjunction analysis and an end product in terms of conjunction analysis. So with that contribution, I hope we can inspire others, and as my colleague John Vanderland from also works inside the JSPOC says, we'll encourage by leadership in setting norms on what we do. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Our next speaker is Craig Smith. He's CEO of EOS Space Systems. Professor Craig Smith is the CEO and technical director of EOS Space Systems, leads a multidisciplinary team of science and engineering innovators developing lasers, beam directors, precision timing systems, sensors, and control systems for laser tracking products. EOS builds and operates systems for the satellite laser ranging to compliant targets and space debris tracking using active laser technologies. Craig?
Thank you, Brian. Thanks for the invitation. Thanks to Maui Economic Development Board and the AMOS conference. I've been coming to this conference since the second meeting in 2001, which was unfortunately, the first day was cancelled due to the 9/11, and the rest of us spent the rest of the week skulking around without badges on and pretending we weren't congregating in places. But it was still a very productive meeting, and I think it's grown amazingly since that second meeting. And also at that meeting, I think I was probably maybe the only foreign national person at the meeting, and now there's a very significant contingent. We've seen the field open up to an international group, and it's not just one group. EOS builds, or has for about 30 years, been building ground-based satellite tracking systems, primarily using lasers for high precision. We don't track everything in the sky, but we track some things to very high accuracy, some things to like a millimetre in space, and the others to around a metre in space. But the tack I would like to take today is about public-private partnerships. And during that whole time, we've been working with the government in what we call, in Australia at least, public-private arrangements, where both industry funds and government funds are pooled together to create larger, more capable, better systems than either of us would have been prepared to do separately. Now, Australia's a slightly different situation from the US, where there's a lot less government funds around. Well, some would argue that, I suppose, in the US as well. But it's been a very successful model, and I think it's one that we're looking at pursuing going forward. And there are reasons for that, in that industry certainly has a role to play in space. But we're also realistic that government also is a significant role. And in the end, the governments, and everybody's governments, are responsible, ultimately responsible, for everything that is launched by any of their citizens. So the Australian government, more likely or not, is responsible for anything that is launched by an Australian party, whether they did it or not. And so they bear the ultimate responsibility. There are also services which are obviously government run, national security issues, clearly. But space surveillance running from national security, they have their own particular mission. and it drives particular ways of doing things. In particular, the on-demand, all-weather requirement for a national security mission leads to particular solutions, which aren't always they're the right solution for that mission, but they're not always the cheapest and the right solution for all missions. And we're looking at being able to expand those capabilities to get the perhaps hopefully cheaper, more capable systems for the wider mission, not just the military mission. There are also functions which are also clearly always in the government's realm. They're social good, and for the fee-for-service model doesn't always fit well with all services. And a good example is emergency services. We don't normally contract out or to the cheapest bidder. Emergency ambulance services, fire department, those usually stay within government functions because they're more appropriately provided from there. And we don't deny people services, those sort of essential services, just if they haven't paid. Well, usually we don't. So we think that private and government partnerships have a significant role to play. So I'll change the direction slightly to talk a little bit about the Space Environment Research Centre that is being set up, initially set up in Australia, which is a consortium of like-minded organisations, companies, universities and governments and countries to try and look at remediation or mitigation of some of the issues of space debris and potential collisions in space. So the objectives of the Space Environment Research Centre are to develop technologies that will help us mitigate collisions in space. And I think I don't need to tell really anyone in this audience what we've done over the last 50 years of our use of space, but its typical use of space has been the same as human endeavour throughout history. We take natural resources, we trash them, we make them almost unusable. The rivers, the oceans, the atmosphere, we take them to the brink, and then we sort of think, oh, what have we done? And we start to pull back and look at ways to remediate, and that's exactly where we're going with the Space Environment Research Centre. So we have got Australian government funding, we have satellite operators, we have launch capability people involved, we have research organisations to try and look at ways how we might work on remediating these things. So there are a couple of programs there. One is to be able to propagate our orbits more accurately. Currently we just use cannonball models for what an object is. We want to take realistic measurements of what things are and try to get better at propagation. We looking at conjunction analysis so we can predict when things are coming close. When things do come close, we want to be able to use our precision tracking capabilities to find out how close they're really coming, because we want to be able to, people don't want to be manoeuvring their satellites all the time. That uses fuel, they're not on station when they're doing it. They only want to manoeuvre when they really should be manoeuvring. And then the other thing is that when debris crashing into a satellite, that's bad, but the satellite owners usually can manoeuvre their satellites. Debris crashing into other debris, everybody loses when that happens because the whole environment becomes more and more contaminated. And it's not just the satellite owners who are at risk. Everybody becomes at greater risk every time there's a collision. So what do we do about debris-on-debris collisions? A lot of talk about active debris removal, going up there, harpooning things, bringing them back down. Those things are still a fair way away before they're commercially affordable, I would say. So we're looking at means to stop debris collisions by using high-power lasers from the ground to change the orbits of smaller debris objects so that to avoid a collision, not to actually deorbit things or bring space debris down. If we can stop those collisions occurring, then we can stop the exponential growth of the amount of stuff in space. Hopefully nature can take its course, bring some of that stuff down in its own time, and also buys us time to look at other techniques by which we can also remediate space. So that's a 5-year program. It's a good model of government and universities and private investment to try and look at the way we protect our environment. And finally, I'll touch on a program that EOS and Lockheed Martin are putting together to develop ground-based space tracking capabilities, mainly for precision tracking with a view to conjunction prediction and avoidance. We're installing our second ground station now. It's also got a government component to it, so we don't ask government to pay for everything. They're one of the customers, but they're not the only customer. There's a much wider industry which have requirements. It's not always the same requirement as the government, and so the government, Australian government, is partnering with us to help with some of that infrastructure. And so we think there's a bright future. Clearly there are government roles, there are industry roles, and there are blended roles, and we're trying to work with regulatory and government and all the stakeholders to develop useful capabilities that preserve space, remediate the damage we've done to it already, and make it useful for everybody going forward. So new countries new players in space get the benefit of using it, not just the old players. And space will still be there for everyone to use in another 50 years from now. Thank you.
Thank you. So our final panelist this morning is Paul Welsh. Paul Welsh is the Vice President of Business Development for Analytical Graphics Incorporated. Paul's responsible for the development and capture of program opportunities, management of AGI business partners, and the execution of strategic market initiatives, including the Commercial Space Operations Center. Mr. Welsh is also the executive sponsor for AGI's Space Data Association activities. Paul?
Thank you, Brian. And thank you to MEDB for this opportunity to be here in Maui. And thanks also to the audience for hanging in there. I know this was your last chance to go snorkeling before you head out, so hopefully you made the right choice. We'll do our best to make that a true statement. I'm going to talk about some ideas regarding government and free markets with strong caveat that I'm not an economist. Then show some practical numbers to inject some reality and urgency into the discussion of debris warnings and just what we're looking at here. And then lastly, if we have time, we'll show a quick video to further demonstrate the situation. And the video, of course, is one of the videos that was playing when you came in, so it won't be a big surprise. Sorry about that. So the fundamental question Brian posed to us when we joined this panel was, whose responsibility is it to track the objects in space? And given that the U.S. military is the one with the job now, what should be their role going forward? So the answers I came up with were first off to just point out that the foundation of a free market economic theory is that all the economic actors pursue their own self-interest, and then assuming all those actors bear the cost of their actions, then the invisible hand principle takes over, economic growth is maximized, and all of society benefits. Now, if there's a market imperfection, such that the actors don't fully bear the cost or the consequences of their actions, then it's the role of government to step in and correct that imperfection. Factories along a river, other types of pollutions examples are examples of that. And government-imposed corrections in those examples can include regulation, monitoring, licensing, enforcing standards of behavior, any or all those things. That's done to ensure that common resource is preserved for the benefit of economic actors now and into the future. The common pooled resource of space is not unlike the river, probably with the most notable exception that it's going to be a lot harder to remediate the problem of space debris than a river brought to the brink, right? So, so bottom line, there is a role of government. And that role is to correct that market imperfection. Now, it needs to be done in a careful, balanced manner that does not overly dampen private enterprise, but also protects the greater good. And George did a good job of summarizing that, you have that regulatory role while at the same time promoting that private enterprise. That was gratifying to hear. That's a wise charter. So people often refer to space traffic management as an inherently governmental function, and again, it's only this regulatory role that is inherently governmental. The actual implementation of the space traffic management That can be done by commercial entities supporting the regulatory authority or public-private partnerships. So what are the roles of the various players? So for instance, the private actors in SSA, and by that I mean commercial operators such as Mike and Stuart. Their best interest is to get out in front of this problem, proactively demonstrate by their intentions and actions that they're going to be responsible operators, take control of their own destiny. They can define the standards of behavior that, if conceived and implemented well, could eventually evolve into the regulatory rules that are placed upon them. So you can get, be sure that there's no overreach, and be sure that you establish the standards for all other operators. You could even argue that if you do that well enough, further regulatory oversight may not be required. Even in this case, even the threat of regulatory oversight would be enough to inspire the responsible behavior. Good examples of this, OneWeb, if you go to their website, it's got some fantastic language about that. There's a clear commitment in that regard. Mike, I think you may have written it, so well done. And then Space Data Association's another example. It's an organization of operators committed to the safety of space operations. This model of operators regulating themselves does have its limits, however. And that namely is because it only takes one bad operator to cause a disaster in space and really ruin it for everyone. And then even the most responsible operators can still hit the rocks, go out of business, and leave others with the aftermath. Speaking objectively, the best way, I think, to demonstrate a responsible space operator is to become a customer of the ComSpot. So we could talk more later, right? What about the military? What's the role of the military in SSA and in STM, right? And I just draw those two distinctions. First thing to say is there are, I presume, all kinds of military reasons for which the military needs the most full and complete SSA possible. That role will never cease. They'll continue to pursue and maintain that SSA. Does that mean they should also be executing non-military space traffic management? I think the answer is no, and I think you've heard that in various talks throughout the week and from George just before this panel. It's a distraction from their military mission. It's not needed by their military mission. Again, their mission's to know all, but that doesn't require that they need to be the traffic cops of the world. That mission would be a lower priority than their military mission, and there's also always going to be an inherent conflict with regard to the transparency required to do good STM versus the natural tendency of any military operation, which is to not be transparent. So for these reasons, I think having the DoD as the STM authority will never be as effective as a separate entity. So that's where we need to move to, and I think ignoring this reality only increases the risks of further pollution of the common pooled resource of space. So to be clear, the only reason we're really talking about it now is that the DoD is filling this role. And we are all grateful to them for doing so up until this point. I think we should be all clear-eyed about moving on to a new future. And again, while being gracious and thankful for them for doing it for so long, I think, Stuart, you stated that well earlier. There's other examples throughout history. Air traffic management has been mentioned several times this week. Airmail is another example, not often thought of anymore, but 100 years ago, that was a purely U.S. military operation. Eventually, commercial airlines got in the game and took that over. There's all kinds of examples where commercial actors and non-military government actors delivering a function that was first pioneered by the U.S. military. So, change is inevitable. We've heard it from DoD leadership at this conference and throughout the year. It's all very consistent. Now that said, let's talk about change. Change is hard. An enabling concept of ComSpot and a lot of the private space activity here is that there's an accumulation of technology innovations that have occurred over the years. Moore's Law is the foundational principle there, and those have not yet found themselves fully into the space industry. I like to use the term pent-up innovation to describe that force that ultimately is going to disrupt and change the status quo. We're seeing a lot of that happening now. In the rearview mirror of history, these evolutions are going to be viewed as natural and inevitable, but to those involved at the time of the transitions, like we are right now, it's just never that clear. It applies well beyond our industry, and a corollary truth to ourselves and other industries is that the primary obstacle to new ways of doing things is the current way of doing things. Staying power of the status quo can be the passive inertia of existing methods and high switching costs. Another element is the active resistance of the economic actors who stand to lose out by that change. So what's the best way to proceed? I think leaning forward and embracing that change is the only way to go. The DoD can help to accelerate that change by becoming an early adopter of the new technologies. And that will be consistent with their goal of improving their SSA, needed for their military mission, and also helps the process of getting them out of the game of the non-military space traffic management, which again is in support of their mission. Mixed messages still persist despite clear direction signaled by DoD leadership. The uncertainty that results from those mixed messages about the way forward has the unintended consequence of disrupting private sector investment decisions and then postpones the availability of effective space traffic management benefits for all of us. So shifting gears, if you could go to the next slide. Sorry, I forgot to grab the chart clicker. Here's a chart with some of the systems proposed and our analysis of the expected number of warnings that will be issued by our traditional methods now. And also in the right, the second to right column, the expected number of collisions that will occur in the absence of effective collision avoidance over a 10-year period. Number of takeaways here. The number of conjunction warnings will be so numerous as to be not actionable. You could argue completely useless. Much higher accuracy tracking is required to receive fewer warnings and have those warnings be actionable. That is what we'll deliver from the CommSpot. Looking at the number of warnings needed to be issued when these systems are online, OneWeb and SpaceX, NorthStar and others. We had said earlier the space traffic management would be a distraction for the DoD. It'd be more than a distraction, it would be all that they would be doing, short of adding a huge number of assets or a number of resources. Doesn't make sense, it's not necessary, there are better alternatives. These numbers you're looking at are based on the public catalog, which is objects larger than 10 centimeters or greater in size. As you've heard this week, there are 10 times that number of objects greater than 2 centimeters. So multiply the numbers in the last two columns by a factor of 10 to see what the problem's going to be when we're tracking that number of objects. Another comment, look at the numbers for Iridium. They only have about 70 satellites, but their warning numbers are as high as OneWeb, in fact higher, which is flying 10 times their number of satellites. Why is that? Obviously, they're flying in the debris field from the 2009 Cosmos collisions and the 2 debris events they had last year. Their numbers clearly demonstrate you do not want to have that first collision. It's not clear what's going to happen going forward in their orbit regime. They're now launching their next generation constellation into the same altitude. It's very messy up there already, and it's not going to be getting any better. It'll also serve to complicate Mike and Stuart's lives as well, since getting on orbit, they need to go through there to get where they're going. And then lastly, just to go on to the video, you've seen it already. If you could go to the next slide, please. This is, no AGI presentation is complete without a video sometime in it. So this just illustrates the distribution of objects by size, starting with the larger ones and introducing them. You can see the growth as the object size gets smaller. And right at this point, that's the public catalog. And then the next series of additions will be the other 180,000 objects between 10 centimeters and 2 centimeters in size. It illustrates the point that there's a lot of them out there, and it's a big problem we've got to solve. That concludes my remarks. I look forward to your questions.
All right, thank you. So we already have some questions coming in. Please, if you have them, please text the number on top of the screen. I think the one I want to start with is a question for each of you. You know, you're each working on a little bit different area. We've got a couple operators, we got somebody doing space tracking, we got somebody providing SS services. Each of you in that area is trying to innovate. You're trying to do something new, push the boundaries a little bit, challenge what's out there already. What do you find is the biggest challenge in what you're trying to do? Is it policy? Is it regulation? Is it competition? Is it what do you see as that biggest challenge?
Sure, I'll start. The biggest challenge that we come across is that the awareness of this issue, the need for these services, is we have to demonstrate through analysis and a lot of illustration, just what the risks are. And again, as I mentioned, the staying power of the status quo is a strong thing. To move people into the new reality is a lot of hard work. We're up for it. We believe that there's a strong business to be made. There's like dire needs that are out there, but the staying power of the status quo and the uncertainty going forward of what options are going to be available is what keeps people from going forward.
Well, I think one of the largest challenges for our design is probably the policy and regulatory environment. Just with a global communication system, interacting with various governments worldwide is definitely a big challenge. That's why we have such a large regulatory team. But luckily, there are various policies in place with the ITU and FCC, FAA, and it's a clear path forward. But providing the right risk analysis and showing that we're compliant is a big part of what I do. So it's a challenge, but it's not an impossibility.
I think gladly, based on a lot of the discussions I've had here, I would say it's not necessarily regulatory challenges that are facing us. Those are challenges that appear to be falling on benevolent ears or sympathetic ears. As a commercial entity, your biggest challenge is making sure that when you switch on your satellite, when it gets into orbit, you're generating revenue. And so we have a philosophy at Northstar, which essentially says the customer has to be built into the architecture of the system and not assume that the customer will be there when we're FOC. And if you think of a standard hockey curve, a hockey stick, which is our favorite analogy in Canada, the time scale, if you look at adoption, and again, I refer back to my comment about standing on the shoulders of giants. I worked on RadarSat-1, which was launched in November 1994. And if you plot the hockey stick curve of number of images downloaded or used from RadarSat or RadarSat-2 or RadarSat Constellation mission, which is the follow-on, versus time, you'll go from 1994 to 2015, and the curve will look like this. It gets very steep at the end. That's essentially the government doing its job. That's the giant's shoulders that we stand on. Over those years, from 1994 till now, the world got used to the concept of using Earth observation data and adopting that as a way of solving problems. That could never have been done by industry. It would have taken too long. So that curve, which Eric Lefebvre, in charge of space utilization at the Canadian Space Agency, I asked him if I could borrow that slide. I didn't get it, but that doesn't matter. I said to him, the axis of that curve for any commercial space operations is measured in minutes. That's how many minutes I need before I start generating revenue and having people adopt it. So our biggest challenge, and I think anybody's biggest challenge, unless you're kidding yourself, is that you can raise money. You can spend other people's money, but you can't buy customers. That's a philosophy that doesn't seem prevalent in a lot of propositions that go forward in terms of occupying space and making use of space and delivering services. But our biggest headlines hopefully will not be how much money we have raised, because at the end of the day, if you have a really good team of people on board, raising money can be done. But effectively spending that money, which is other people's money, and turning it into revenue in minutes, not years, before you have to file for Chapter 11 and turn it into something else, is not an easy task. And again, we stand on the shoulders of giants, because those who had vision and those who had daring and those who had courage went before us and tried it, and we saw what the results were. And we learned, hopefully, from those results, and we built that into our business model. So our philosophy, which may lead us to be a very slow growing or slower growing than other propositions, is to definitely have the customer on board working with us, included in our business model, in our architecture, and preferably buying data from us in the form of airborne or other formats before we even launch. That's the biggest challenge for a commercial entity.
I think in sort of looking at remediating space, how we're going to improve things, I think we all understand it's a global problem. No one organisation, country can sort this out on its own. And so we need to have an international cooperation. International cooperation, however, needs transparency and needs trust. And so we need to be developing structures and processes by which everyone can engage so that we can bring everyone together. Otherwise, we're just working individually and doing our own things for our own potential no national interests or commercial interests, and we won't end up with a global solution that works for the long term.
So, Craig, on the subject of debris remediation, I think that was a topic, at least in my impression, was gaining interest over the last several years, but it almost seems to have dropped off a bit in terms of willingness to consider that and perhaps even, push to actually develop the technologies and look at how to do it. Do you think it's dropped off a bit? And if it has, do you know why, or can you guess?
Well, there's been lots of ideas out there. Nothing yet proven to be economically viable, I think, has been the problem. So we're still searching for the way that we can afford to do it without someone having to spend trillions of dollars to make it happen, or who knows what the number is. But we are looking for an economically viable way to remediate. And so bringing some of the big stuff down, that will potentially stop things getting worse in the future. It doesn't do anything to reduce your current collision risk. And so there are two aspects to it. And one is to, yes, bring down big stuff. Two is to do something about stopping collisions happening right now. But I think it's come down to cost, not will.
So I'm going to combine two questions here together. One asks, is there still a residual Cold War mentality among governments and in the traditional players that has an impact on some of the innovation and some of the new things you guys are looking to do? And then another question that is sort of related to that is, recently we've seen increased discussions about space as a military domain. Do you see those as having an impact on what you guys are trying to do? And if so, how?
Wow. First part of the question was what?
Do you think that there's sort of a legacy Cold War mindset among some of the government?
Yeah. There's nothing like a good Cold War to motivate people to be innovative. So I think that's maybe a fact of life, maybe not be a fact of life. But at least when the Cold War was on, the lines were clear. The lines aren't so clear anymore from a geopolitical perspective. I think the Cold War is over, but in that sense, understanding who your enemies are is a lot more complicated now than it was then. So I think some people may be longing for a decent Cold War to have things back on track. The challenges that we face, the Wright brothers were not necessarily developing aircraft for their own bicycle business. They were developing them for potential military applications. We've always understood that having a perspective is important, whether you're standing on top of a hill or standing on a mountain or standing in a balloon or standing in an aircraft or looking from a spacecraft. Perspective is important, so having that perspective will always have a certain military component to it, and that's why it's inherent in our business model that we have a strong group of people working with the appropriate authorities and regulators and powers that be in the United States to do a responsible job of both operating our satellites as a commercial entity and potentially providing our data and data services, I should say, but providing our conjunction analysis data for collision avoidance. And so that's a responsibility we share with the military and a welcomed responsibility.
I guess I would only say I don't attribute resistance to commercial solutions, if any exists, as a Cold War mentality or anything. I think it's more a natural consequence of the incentive structures in our business, right? There's a way to procure things. There's a way that systems are developed in which the money is flowing the whole time a capability is being built, and the money, when a capability is delivered, stops flowing, right? Whereas with commercial activities, it's completely different in that commercial investment takes place, the products are delivered, and then the money starts flowing once that's online, right? So that's a fundamentally different approach, and the profit motive that drives all that and the risk reward, is what the commercial model is all about. So I think I would attribute most of the resistance, in the system, to be the clash of those incentive structures, and not the Cold War, which we did well to win through our economic prowess, right?
So there's a couple of questions here talking about liability challenges, and in two ways. So for Paul, there's a question here about what kind of liability considerations do you guys think you have to face and deal with in terms of you're providing data to these operators and what they're going to do with it, and whether or not the accuracy and the reliability of that, and then also for the two satellite operators, there's a question: what happens if, obviously not you guys, but one of your competitors goes out of business? What happens to that satellite constellation? Is it just going to be up there forever, or is that something that even enters into your consideration about what happens as part of, the liability for putting that stuff up there? So, Paul?
Yeah, I would start with regard to the liability. That's a risk that needs to be taken into account as part of the business planning. We're an advisory service. The other advisory services that exist, the Space Data Association, how the JSPOC does their operations, it's all very clear, which is information is provided. The decisions are made about maneuvering or not on the operator side. And you really need to have all the arrangements very clearly specified and agreed to. That's not going to prevent someone from attempting to take legal action. Should they see fit. It's another thing that America is built on, right? Is the prospect of litigation. But we think that's a manageable risk.
We've looked at several analyses for our deorbit plan, and one of the things we've recognized is that the 25-year rule is simply not enough. We can't leave our satellites to decay in that sort of orbit. We need to go much lower and decay much quicker. So the question about whether or not if something happened and the constellation was left at a much higher altitude, we've seen through analysis that this is just a scenario that would be completely unacceptable. And have serious impacts. So, that simply can't happen.
So you guys have plans to exceed the 25-year guideline?
Yeah, I guess you could say exceed. Or really, we're going to be aiming for less than 5 years, hopefully 2 years. We have electric propulsion. And so we'll be bringing them down so they re-enter much quicker than 25 years, because we can't leave several uncontrolled satellites. That's effectively space debris.
So yesterday morning, there was, at the panel discussion, there was quite a bit of discussion about norms of behavior. And I'd like your take from each of you as new entrants. Do you see, norms as an obstacle to innovation, to what you guys want to do? Do you see it as something that you think what you're trying to do is part of? I mean, how do you approach that subject?
Well, yeah, I think observing and look at what the norms of behavior is very, very important, because it's founded on lots of experience and lots of analysis. But as a large constellation, we have to look at that and we have to ask ourselves if these norms are sufficient for safe flight. For example, the deorbit guideline. And another thing that we're looking at is our collision risk stance and what's acceptable for when do we have to make maneuvers and when do we accept a risk, and is really the norms that one-off operators use. Is that acceptable for us, or do we need to improve upon that or develop new analyses altogether?
Yeah, I said it tongue-in-cheek a little bit earlier, but our model really is to establish a service that can enable responsible behavior and enable it to be done for operators such that it's not an onerous task, that impinges upon their primary mission. So we're all for it. And when I was saying utilizing ComSpoc's an example of responsible behavior, it's in that regard. We're trying to make it a painless thing to be responsible.
I would add, having a framework of expected behaviour can only be a good thing for all of the operators. Makes it easier to get investment to do things, because you can at least have some reasonably predictable outcomes. If we're all just cowboys in space, then anything can happen, and it's really hard to convince people to invest.
I was speaking with Sandy last night at the reception about this subject, and at the risk of boring her to tears, I'll maybe go through what I said to her. When you talk about norms of behavior, you start to get into a different field of thinking, which I would say is more philosophical. It's philosophy. And what is your philosophy as you approach it? The wonderful thing about space, and I think it's maybe the thing that attracts us all to it, is that when we look at what we're doing at space, you have maybe an even deeper appreciation of what we're doing on our own little tiny planet. You see it from a different perspective. You change the way you see yourself. And when you think about our norms of behavior on Earth, you can apply those to say, well, what kind of norms of behavior would we like to put on Earth as opposed to what we'd like to have in space? It's a philosophy. There's challenges that we'll all face, and does anybody really want to use space for negative or malicious purposes? I would argue no. There's challenges that face us philosophically. Even usually it ends up being at the political level or the political debate level, and there's topics that people will have strong opinions of one way or another as to how you would address them, but it breaks down to your philosophy. How do you deal with the subject of abortion? How do you deal with the subject of immigration? How do you deal with the subject of drugs and the use of drugs and the monitoring and the policing of drugs? How do you deal with norms in space? There's a philosophy that you will bring to all of that. My hope is that humanity at its core is positive and encouraging and visionary. And so that philosophy will override a lot of need for policing of what we have to do in space. It will be used for what it always is intended for, good things.
All right, please join me in thanking our panelists for this morning's discussion.